Welcome, everyone. My name is Dawn Hammett, and I'm the director of the Eisenhower Presidential Library here in beautiful and cold Abilene, Kansas. I'd like to welcome you to today's Lunch and Learn. We're really excited about this program. But first, I actually have something exciting to share. You know that we have been working to have a new education specialist with us, and our new education specialist is here. Her name is Joy. Joy, can you talk for a second so the camera's on you? Tell us about yourself a little bit.
Hello, everyone. I'm Joy. I am greeting you right now from sunny Florida, but I will be moving to Kansas soon. I come here from Carter County, which is Naples, Florida, and in their museum system, and I'm really excited to be here, and I'm looking forward to learning and meeting everyone and learning all about Ike.
Thank you, Joy. We're really excited to have her join our team. So Samantha, if you want to present the slide again, I'm sorry. So today's program is entitled Champion of Peace. This is a topic that we thought about a lot as we were building the new exhibits. We talked about how Eisenhower's international relationships and international travel created an environment that allowed the United States to stay safe during his presidential administration. So to talk about that today, we have both Troy. Oh, my screen is bumping around. I'm sorry, Troy. We have both Troy Elkins. He's on our museum team. He's our museum registrar. He is a doctoral candidate at the Kansas State University. And we also have Jeff Nelson, who is part of our museum team as well, who is a master's degree in history from Kansas State. Jeff and Troy, could you just say a little bit about yourself so we can see you, and then we'll bounce it over.
Okay, I'll start. My name is Jeff Nelson. I'm on the curatorial staff for the museum at the Eisenhower Presidential Library. I've been working for the Eisenhower Library for about 6 years now. Have a great job doing it. It's a wonderful place to be, and look forward to being able to tell you guys a little bit more about President Eisenhower today.
Thank you. And Troy, once you introduce yourself, I believe that you could just go ahead into your talk, okay?
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Troy Elkins. I'm the museum registrar. Put in simple terms, I get to do all the fun stuff, like move artifacts and make exhibits. And then I get the not so fun stuff that goes with it, which is keeping up with all the paperwork on that stuff at the same time. Luckily, Jeff gets to avoid all of that. So I've been with the museum, with the Presidential Library for about 11 years now. And, it's one of those jobs that I kind of fell into, and it's been a realization of a lifetime love. So it's everything we do here as a curatorial team, we can't help but get excited about, and our spouses and our friends both kind of roll their eyes at us every time we come home and start talking about work. Anyway, but I would like to thank Dawn for allowing us to put this program on, and Samantha for all your excellent technical work in getting it all lined up. Normally, when we do the Lunch and Learns, they're helped and produced or put on by the Eisenhower Foundation. Since we're been operating under COVID terms and everything, they're not as active, or the support they give is still there. It's just I do want to thank them. We're just not getting the lunch to go with the learn unless we just provide it ourselves. So. And I'd also like to thank all the guests that have signed on and joined us today, and hopefully we'll give you something to think about and learn a few things. So this program poses two questions. The first question is, how did Eisenhower become the champion of peace? And the second question is, as president, how did he use his power and influence to foster that peace? I'm going to take on the first part of that question and cover up to his inauguration as president, and Jeff will handle the second question. it's a weird question. How is it? It almost seems like an oxymoron. How would a person that spent a majority of their life studying war, learning how to apply not just manpower, but technology, industry, and everything towards fighting major battles? It's weird. It seems weird that the man that studied all this, who ended up leading an allied army of multiple nations of over 5 million men, would be the person who would be such a large advocate for peace. And that was just a few decades later. Well, his foundations for this starts in Abilene. And actually, for the majority of his life, he was always reading, observing, listening, and learning from other people and those around him. The lessons he gained over time, they built and compounded on each other, and they created a person who understood that peace is not, a lasting peace is not the normal state of humanity, yet is the most desirable. Ike learned several lessons about diplomacy from his boyhood time in Abilene. His first lesson, and a lot of these stories, you can read about them in his book, At Ease, which gives some of the best detail of his life as a young boy growing up until he was a president. He mentions that allies are always needed. And he learned this lesson one of his very first days at school. He was being chased around the playground by a larger bully, and he ran around a couple of times trying to avoid this guy. And finally, his older brother basically said, "That's enough," and came in and defended Ike and stopped it. Another story is that sometimes strength is required, and sometimes peace is not advantageous. Both Ike and David, Eisenhower's parents, were pretty much pacifists and would not really accept too much fighting. One day, Ike came running home from school being chased by another boy, and his dad, David's standing there, is like, why are you letting this boy chase you around? And Ike said, "Well, if I fight him, you're going to give me a licking. If I don't fight him, you're going to give me a licking. I lose either way." And his dad's like, "No, you turn around, you take care of this." And Ike proceeded to show quite a bit of strength by knocking the other boy down, say, "If you come at me again, we're going to have a very long year because every day I'm going to be on you." And third story, which growing up in a rural community and having some farmland for a time, I can definitely associate with, was he went and spent some time with his aunt and uncle in north of Topeka, and they had a gander that really did not like Ike, and he was about 5 or 6 years old at this time, and would chase Ike all around the yard. Well, eventually Ike's uncle got upset and tired of him doing that, of running away, so he handed him a broom handle that he cut the broom off of, and he said, "Next time that gander comes at you, you give him a whack." Well, sure enough, the gander comes at him, and Ike takes a swing at him and lands a hit on him, and he says that kind of instigated an uneasy peace between the two, that the gander would stay out of his way but sit and honk at him the entire time. So there's the groundwork for what would become Ike's ideas on peace and how to foster peace are being born here. His mom taught him a lesson that hatred is futile, that anger is futile, and this comes from when Ike got so mad that his brothers were being allowed to do something that he wasn't, that he beat his hands against a tree until they were really tore up and bleeding. And after he calmed down and everything, his mom was dressing his wounds, and she was talking to him about some scripture and also about hatred, and saying that you have to control this. And if you have, I mean, too much hatred, or even hatred itself, becomes futile, and all it is destructive. And probably the last lesson he demonstrates coming out of Abilene is the small town community being tied in so closely with others that there is a built-in concern for your neighbor. And that it was this concern that should be fostered and grow between more than just your local neighbors. It should be spread out over communities. As a child, he notes that he loved reading historical fiction or historical books, to the point his mom actually locked the books up and told him, "Hey, you cannot read this. You got to do your other schoolwork." And he found that he always cheered for the underdogs. And one of his favorite historical personas was Hannibal, and how he pursued the fight against Rome and against overwhelming odds, and was able to keep Rome at bay from Carthage for so many years. This idea of always being for the underdog will come back into play here in a little bit. When Ike graduates high school, he finally ends up at West Point, and he's immediately introduced to boys that are of roughly the same age. He's a little bit older, but of different upbringings, different education, and different parts of the United States. So while he's learning from these other cadets, he's learning about, their traditions, where they're from, their lifestyle, and while there's a lot of commonalities between them, for each region and each region, there's a little bit of difference. After he gets out of West Point and he goes into the Army, the early Army days, he's bounced around he starts out at Fort Sam Houston, and then World War I starts, and he's bounced around from posting to posting, and does a lot of training. And now he's exposed to not only men that were educated, as were most of the students at West Point. He's introduced to uneducated. He's introduced to all financial and social aspects of the young men age group, or of the early manhood age group, the guys that were volunteering and being drafted for the war. After the war, he experiences the same thing, but with the convoy across the United States in 1919. He experiences finding whole new regions of the U.S. that he hadn't been to. And he's not talking to boys that are men that are in his same age group that have the same military background or anything like that. These are the common people that are coming out to meet this impressive convoy going across the United States. And it's not that he just drives by and waves. He does stop. He does talk to them. So they can have the speed of the convoy was such, and the mechanical problems on the convoy was such, that they stopped pretty often and had to do repairs and stuff in these towns. Like the photo here is of a woman bringing out a big wash tub full of lemonade to give to the soldiers as they're driving through. So while he's doing this, he's acting as an ambassador for the Army. At the same time, he's learning about regions and people of the U.S. that he had not been exposed to previously. This comes down to wanting to understand the hopes and the fears of people. In 1956, he'll make a quote that says, "People are what count. A sympathetic understanding of the aspirations, the hopes and fears, the traditions and prides of other peoples and nations is essential to the promotion of mutual prosperity and peace." So while he's doing these travels, he's learning about these traditions, what these people take pride in. And yes, they're Americans, and they all have a basic similar background, but there are also major regional differences. And you're also talking at the turn of the century when you still had solid immigrant enclaves, even in the Midwest and the West, that he's encountering and learning more from. each one of these moments has exposed Eisenhower to the aspirations and traditions of these people. When it comes to the hopes and fears, he had an introduction himself to these. And his first hope of being sent over to France to fight in World War I is dashed. He's so important with training that they will not let him leave. When they finally do have him signed up to leave, the war ends. So to be spent the last 5 or 6 years of his life learning and preparing for war and being left out, it did affect him. And probably his worst fear became realized when, after the war, he's stationed in Camp Meade, and his son, Dow Dwight, whose nickname is Icky, dies of scarlet fever. This devastates him. He writes 60 years later, "There's never been a point in my life worse for me than that day." And this creates a sympathy, maybe a sense of empathy in him, that everybody has hopes and dreams. Everybody has hopes and fears. And we all have to respect that and understand that if we want to get along. So also during the interwar, Ike was doing what the Army stuff you would do. He was serving with different commands. He actually managed to get himself some prime spots for education in the Command and General Staff School and the Army War College. But he also was able to encounter and travel and finally meet people from people overseas on their own territory. This exposure, he started out in Panama and then France and the Philippines. In each place, he was exposed to the people and learned on their traditions and how they acted. While he was in France, and he was working for the Battle Monuments Commission, writing or revising a battlefield guide for U.S. soldiers that had fought in World War I, he gets the habit of, when he goes out and tours these battlefields, he puts a lunch in the trunk of his car. And it's usually a wine and some canned meat, some other stuff. And anytime he sees, and when he's driving around for lunch, anytime he sees French locals sitting on the side of the road having lunch, he pulls over and shares his lunch with them. And he's doing this because he wants to talk to the people and learn from them, and also just kind of share the goodwill. And this is really his exposure to diplomacy of one-on-one, that this was not something he had to do. He could have taken lunches on his own and not been worried about trying to translate what was being said and everything. But instead, he's reaching out to people to get to know them and learn what their lives are about. In the Philippines, his diplomacy gets a lot more important because while he's working on MacArthur's staff, he basically becomes the point of contact for the Philippine president, Quezon. And anytime he actually has an office right next to the president, so that anytime there's a question or issue, that he can go and work between MacArthur and Quezon and help build up the Philippine army as they're trying to prepare to become an independent nation. And frankly, his skills of diplomacy are honed quite well while serving under MacArthur, who was probably not the easiest of bosses to work with. World War II rolls around, and it's already been, by the time the United States invades North Africa on November 8, 1942, it's already been a roller coaster for Ike. He's gone from being a colonel just 2 years prior to being a general in charge of a major offensive. The difficulties are set right off. When they land, they're not landing as an army of occupation. They're landing saying as ones who are trying to free the French people and colonies so that they can join the Allied effort. And this difficulty arises from the military head of the Vichy French government, that's Admiral Jean-François Darlan. Eisenhower had brought a French general, General Giraud. They had him removed from France and put him with the invasion fleet. And he was to talk to all of the French soldiers that were in North Africa and have them surrender and join the Allies and start fighting for the Allies. Well, none of these French soldiers would do that. They totally ignored Giraud. They thought he had no authority. And they would only surrender and join the Allies if Darlan told them to. So Ike is facing a quandary here. He's got, still in 1942, a very limited pool of resources to fight. He knows he's got a German army that's eventually going to be coming where he's for his troops. And now he's got to worry about whether he has to fight the French forces in North Africa or not. And knowing that he does not have the resources to make an army of occupation out of what he has and continue to fight the French and Germans at the same time, he cuts a deal with Darlan. Says, if you'll get the French forces to surrender and fight for us, then you will be named head of the French military, and you will also you can have your title of head of the French government in North Africa and West Africa. On the surface, it's a very satisfactory deal, but the problem as far as getting troops onto our side and preventing unnecessary bloodshed. However, Darlan is a well-known collaborator with the Nazi government, and it raises all kinds it ruffles all kinds of feathers, both in London and the U.S. Eventually, both Roosevelt and Churchill, when they're apprised of the situation, agree that Eisenhower made the correct decision, that to save lives and to foster the peace and get going after our common enemy, the Nazis, you made the right decision. However, this was a tough diplomatic, Eisenhower's first real diplomatic choice, and it was a tough one, and it left a bad taste in his mouth. He was pretty sure he was going to get fired over this. And in the end, it worked out. So the alliance was not easy in itself. There's diplomacy going on. And if you look at the first picture on the left, you have Montgomery and Patton standing there looking at a map together. It is my opinion, and if you can get those two guys to fight on the same side and agree long enough to conduct operations, then you're pretty good at diplomacy, because it was not easy for those two to work together. Each nation has its individual political ideas and how things should be run. This was a contest of wills between the U.S. and Great Britain, even as their alliances. They're trying to decide where to attack next. What's the best strategy? Did we go on a narrow front? Did we go on a broad front? Did we go for the underbelly? Did we go for D-Day? This is a constant discussion. A lot of these are diplomatic discussions that Eisenhower cannot escape, though he has, they become political, and he has to jog that line between the political and in the military. But the thing is both sides every part of the Allies are wanting the same thing, the defeat of Germany and the end of the Nazi reign. This keeps them focused on winning the peace and how to get to that peace. The common goals of each nation have to be found. You don't look at the differences, you look at the common goals and you go with that. That's how you end conflict. That's how you go to build peace. At the end of the war, Ike comes back to the lesson that Ida had taught him years ago, that hatred is futile, and the cost of hatred itself. When he discovered the concentration camps, this is perhaps a watershed for Ike. He's walking through the Odorf concentration camp. He's witnessing the culminating effects of all this hatred. And if you look at the photo on the left, if you look at the face, Ike's face, I am hard pressed if you'll ever find another picture of him being so angry. That is, you know, we've always grown up seeing the photos of him smiling or having a serious look. That is the look of ultimate anger right there, and rightfully so. This is what happens when the commonalities of men are ignored. When people disparage the customs and traditions of one another, and when they fail to even try to understand one another. That you have the Holocaust. As World War II is closing out, and the two atomic bombs dropped on Japan. Ike sees another issue with that. You now have not only people who could come up with the same hatred that the Nazis did, but if they got weapons, modern weapons, how easy it would be to cause every town to look like this, to suffer such losses. This moment, should be a joyous time. The war's over, everyone's coming home, and it was. But there's also a realization that if they don't get a control on this, that the lives lost, the hatred will kill everybody. So Ike holds three major stations after the war. He's the chief of staff of the Army. He ends up being president of Columbia University. And then just as he's really getting full stride and enjoying that job, Truman calls him back and makes him the Supreme Allied Commander of European forces for the North Atlantic Treaty. He was really enjoying what he was doing at Columbia because he felt like he was working to better the lives of people through education and pushing for peace. In each post he did, that was kind of his thing, was start looking for the way for a lasting peace. This lasting peace, he said, can't be built solely on military strength. We have to put the full might of the nation behind us. The education, the science, the sacrifice to make a common good. The role of Supreme Allied Commander, I probably viewed as one of his greatest as far as driving for peace. It was the most important. His goal, and the goal of NATO at the time, was just to provide Western Europe with enough protection that the people could become confident in themselves again as they dug out from the debris of World War II and start producing a fulfilling life that's peaceful. He wanted them to have the confidence to thrive. So Ike has, in a selection of speeches that he's made from World War II to his inauguration, the Eisenhower Library has about 300 pages digitized of that. Of those 300 pages, the word peace or peaceful is used 703 times. The majority of that is between the end of the war and while he's at NATO. These are all different speeches. He gave speeches to the American Legion, for the Army Day, to universities. And each speech, of course, is tailored to the audience he was having at that time. But the principles that he posted about peace were the same. A lasting peace must be accomplished. There's no doubt about that. The cost of war is far too high. With nuclear weapons now, the cost of war is so high that humanity will not survive. Despite all of the time, all of the hours, all of the blood, all the effort put into winning World War II. He believes the work of a lasting peace is much more difficult than that of winning the war. Peace is the underdog. It is not the de facto state of humanity. It is the desired state. The only way to get to that is through education, understanding your fellow humans, learning the commonalities and focusing on that, and respecting the differences of each other. And with that, I'll turn this over to Jeff so he can talk about how that's applied.
Thank you. Thank you, Troy. On January 20th, 1953, Dwight Eisenhower was inaugurated as the 34th President of the United States. He entered office with a deeply developed sense of duty to serve his nation. That sense of duty was developed during his years in the military, where he did nothing but serve the United States. His duty as president, though, was a little bit different than his duty as general. He no longer was there to simply seek victory over enemies. He was there to make sure that the nation as a whole thrived and survived. He also felt an obligation to work for a lasting global peace in a world that was severely divided by ideology. As Troy mentioned earlier, he used the word peace hundreds of times in his speeches up until the presidency. He concluded his inaugural address by highlighting the importance of cooperation in a world that was ever more closely bound economically and politically. He said, "The peace we seek, then, is nothing less than the practice and fulfillment of our whole faith among ourselves and in our dealings with others." One of Eisenhower's greatest tools in his effort to create a more equitable world community was his vision of personal diplomacy and the value he placed on face-to-face communication with other national leaders. There were many hurdles ahead of Eisenhower during his administration. The Cold War with the Soviet Union, which was basically a bilateral division of much of the world based on competing and conflicting ideology, was probably the single greatest impediment to peace that Ike faced. That ideological division was basically came down to the individual freedoms cherished by the Western nations and the collective socialist beliefs held in the Eastern Bloc. This division would color how Ike reacted to international crises throughout his administration. Of nearly as great import to Ike's foreign policy and peace initiatives was the decline of colonialism and the rise of nationalist movements in newly independent nations around the world. These new nations were often rich in resources, but lacking in infrastructure. They struggled to gain a foothold in the global economy. They became fertile ground for the superpowers in their efforts to spread their chosen ideology. So basically, Ike's duty and mission in trying to create global peace was to limit the spread of communism and to promote the development of a lot of new nations that were created with the decline of colonialism in the 1950s. Next, thank you. Cold War issues dominated the foreign policy of Eisenhower's administration. The nuclear arms race, which realistically made war a fatal prospect and made going to war an insane prospect, highlighted that Cold War division. Other agreements seem smaller with the lens of time, but they were major disagreements during Ike's administration. Disagreement over the Allied occupation of Berlin was a major issue during most of his administration, as were uprisings against communist governments in Poland and Hungary. Ultimately, Ike's primary goal was to contain the spread of communist ideology. At the beginning of his first term, Eisenhower attended a press conference on February 25th in 1953. And one of the reporters asked if he would consider meeting with Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin. And more importantly, if he would consider traveling outside the United States to meet with Joseph Stalin. Presidents, by and large, did not make many foreign trips for any reason prior to the mid-20th century. Partly it was due to difficulties in getting overseas. It took a long time to take steamships. Eisenhower's reply to this question about whether he would meet Stalin, who was at the time probably America's staunchest enemy, was, quote, "I would meet anybody, anywhere, where I thought there was the slightest chance of doing any good." So despite the heavy chill in diplomatic relations between the US and the Soviet Union, Eisenhower was willing to use any personal means to reduce tensions between the two nations. Joseph Stalin died of a stroke just 10 days after that press conference, in which Ike opened the door to a possible meeting between the two superpowers. It would be 2 more years before he was able to meet with the new Soviet leadership. That meeting happened at the Geneva Conference in 1955. This Big Four conference consisted of the leaders of the Soviet Union, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. They attended this conference to discuss general disarmament proposals and the disposition of Allied forces in Berlin. The Soviets were particularly upset that Western powers still maintained troops in West Berlin, which was surrounded by East Germany. Eisenhower was chosen to be chairman of the first of this conference's meetings, and he opened the conference by saying the following: "We meet here for a simple purpose. We have come to find a basis for accommodation which will make life safer and happier, not only for the nations we represent, but for people everywhere." So already, in specifically dealing with the Soviet leadership, he's implying that everything they do will have an impact on people around the world. Eisenhower knew there would be little in the way of concrete accomplishments relating to major issues. He did use the conference as a chance to create and strengthen personal relationships with leaders of the most powerful nations in the Northern Hemisphere. He held personal meetings with each government leader, and he was able to learn their strengths and weaknesses. When he returned from Geneva, he wrote a letter to his brother Milton. And in that letter, he discusses the results of the Geneva Conference. He said, "At the moment, I can't possibly make an objective appraisal of the final results of Geneva. There is no doubt in my mind that in the few days we were there, I personally gained insight and understanding that I could never have achieved otherwise." The result of the Geneva Conference was popularly termed the Spirit of Geneva. It resulted in a slight thawing of relations between East and West. Though major points of contention still divided the US and the Soviet Union, the Geneva spirit did allow for a rise in diplomatic, cultural, and economic exchanges, which peaked with the 1959 of Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev to the United States. Eisenhower and Khrushchev were never close, but they did engage in many private conversations that were attended by only one translator. I preferred this style of meeting. I preferred to have as few people as possible when discussing relations with world leaders, because he felt that it allowed the leaders to be more honest and open if there was less ears listening to them. The meetings that Ike and Khrushchev held in at Camp David and in Washington, D.C. did further thaw U.S. relations with the Soviet Union. They brought them closer to an agreement on the disposition of West Berlin. And when Khrushchev finally departed Washington, D.C. for Moscow, he implied to Eisenhower that the personal relationship between the two would prove helpful in approaching their mutual disagreements. Now, Eisenhower also had to deal with the rest of the world. His personal diplomacy did not solely focus on the Soviet Union. He was already quite friendly and knew most of the leaders of Western Europe. England and France were close and very strong allies. Near the end of his presidency, he started meeting with more leaders outside of the Northern Hemisphere. And he met with lots of leaders throughout his administration. On September 28th, 1953, President Ramon Cantera of Panama became the first head of state to visit the White House during the Eisenhower presidency. This was the first of 37 official head of state visits to the White House in the 8 years that Eisenhower was president. In October of 1953, Eisenhower made his first international goodwill visit, visiting with Mexican President Cortines at the opening of the Falcon Dam on the Rio Grande River. All in all, Eisenhower held 210 meetings with heads of state, both at home and abroad. He summed up his beliefs regarding personal diplomacy as follows. For special purposes, I strongly believe that in the conduct of foreign relations, personal discussions between heads of government can be helpful and even imperative. For most of his administration, Eisenhower spent time building or renewing relationships with leaders around the world. His most ambitious goodwill trips happened near the end of his second term as president. Now, unlike a lot of the world leaders he dealt with, the United States was somewhat unique in that the presidency is limited to 2 terms. And at the end of his second term, Ike is what in American politics would be called a lame duck. So he in actuality, or maybe just in people's minds, loses some of his power because other politicians know he cannot be reelected. And so, especially domestically, often presidents start to lose what power they had. Eisenhower's idea, and he understood that it would be harder to work with Congress, his idea was, instead of wasting lame duck time sitting at home, he wanted to make several goodwill trips. And he had his staff plan and organize 3 major goodwill trips in 1959 and 1960. He visited the Near East, Latin America, and the Far East. These goodwill trips resulted in Eisenhower visits to over 20 different nations and allowed him to meet with the leaders of all those nations. On this particular slide, the photograph is of President Eisenhower and Pakistan President Ayub Khan on Eisenhower's arrival in Karachi in 1959. Now, most of these countries he visited were not the normal countries that an American president would visit. They were not the staunchest allies. They were not the strongest enemies. They were emerging nations that were trying to sort out their place in global politics. Pakistan, India, Afghanistan, Iran, Turkey, Tunisia, Morocco, places such as this. Eisenhower was very impressed by how all his meetings with these leaders went. For example, since his photograph is up there, I'll use the example of Pakistan President Ayub Khan. Eisenhower was especially impressed with his bearing and how he discussed developing an emerging democracy in the nation of Pakistan. From the very beginning, I conceived for President Ayub a warm affection which still endures. I have more than once disagreed with his views, but I had no reason to doubt his sincerity. And Eisenhower's meetings with leaders throughout these trips mostly resulted in similar feelings. He was equally impressed with Prime Minister Nehru of India. Private discussions with the charismatic leader led Ike to write, "Understanding between our two governments had been deepened, I felt, and our ease of communication improved." Basically, these visits were designed to expose to a world that had never met Americans what America was about, and to also counter some of the communist propaganda about America and prove to the rest of the world that America was not trying to gain any imperial powers, was not trying to dominate any other countries. We were offering friendship as a means in and of itself. There was no ulterior motive. The president summed up his overall view of the goodwill trips in his memoir, Waging Peace. He said, "I believe that our talks, formal and informal, helped to persuade national leaders and millions of people that the United States had no selfish purpose in cooperating with them, and believed in freely chosen governments for peoples and nations everywhere." Next slide, please. And then finally, Eisenhower's diplomatic efforts and ideas stretched to everyone, to every individual. The ideology of the West that Eisenhower was duty-bound to defend was one of individual freedoms. And so much of his diplomatic effort was designed to get every individual to play a role in creating a more peaceful world. Now, with this idea in mind, the president was instrumental in the founding of two non-governmental organizations in 1956. These organizations both exist to this day and still fulfill Eisenhower's idea of individual diplomacy. People to People International and Sister Cities International. At the first People to People conference in 1956, Ike pointed out that a group controlled by the people and not the government could be effective in reaching out globally with educational, cultural, and humanitarian activities. At the third conference in 1959, he spoke to the delegates saying, "We need more individual diplomats from Main Street, from our farms, schools, laboratories, from every walk of life. People-to-people diplomacy means thousands of part-time ambassadors all working for better relationships among all peoples. Both People to People and Sister Cities International still seek to promote the peaceful exchange of ideas on a global basis to this day. These organizations have been practicing and spreading individual diplomacy for over 65 years. As an example, the city of Abilene, which hosts the Eisenhower Presidential Library, participates in the Sister Cities program, as a sister city in Japan. And they engage in personal, or did until COVID, personal exchanges between the countries, sending young people from Abilene to learn about Japan and hosting young people from Japan to learn about Abilene. and outside. Eisenhower's particular brand of personal diplomacy was overall very effective. During his years as president from 1953 to 1961, the United States was able to navigate many foreign policy storms, in large part due to Eisenhower's personal meetings with national leaders of all stripes. At the end of his administration, relations with our European allies were quite strong, as strong as they had ever been, despite several difficulties in the Mideast. US-Soviet relations on the whole were slightly friendlier at the end of 8 years than they were at the beginning. And goodwill tours created new ties with nations in the Near East, Far East, and Latin America that would help determine how the United States dealt with foreign policy for decades to come. Personal diplomacy, the way Ike practiced it, frankly, as Ike would say, worked. Thank you very much. We have a few moments. If there's any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box or do a hand raise, and Troy and I will try and answer any questions you might have. Okay, Ethan Anderson asks, how did Ike's support for CIA-backed coups in Guatemala and Iran fit into his overall support for peace? Would you argue that Ike believed these efforts would stop the spread of communism and thereby maintain world peace and save lives in the long run? Mr. Anderson, you somewhat answered your own question a little bit. The primary foreign policy goals of the United States during most of Eisenhower's presidency were the containment of the spread of communism. Now, you can do that by promoting peaceful relations, but you also do that through more warlike ways. And Ike was ultimately also trained as a general. So his support for those coups was driven entirely by the administration's belief that they were working to limit the spread of communism, which would maintain world peace and hopefully save lives in the long run. We have a question from Larry.
Yes, do you recommend any good books about the founding of People to People and the Sister Cities program?
I'm not sure how much has actually been written on those two programs. Most of the information I got was from their history sections on their websites directly, and then the Eisenhower Presidential Library website. Under research, if you go under research and then online documents, there's a large section on People to People, which has primary source documents, which are quite informative to read. People to People has developed since its founding. It became more of a unified non-governmental organization about 1961. Initially, it was a series of committees. I believe over 40 committees, focusing on things from music to sports to science, that was designed to promote international spread of goodwill and knowledge. And in the first few years, the committees did have some difficulties because it was non-governmental. Eisenhower said the people need to run this, and all the committee chairmen and members, after about 6 months, realized, oh, that means there's no government money for running this. We have to figure out how to fundraise. And so early on, in addition to trying to develop this system to spread humanities and culture globally and to exchange it, they also had to figure out how to fund it and pay for it. So I'm not sure. If you can, send an email to our research at our website, and we can check to see if we have any books, or if, frankly, if anyone's written anything on the founding of those two groups.
Thank you.
There's another question in the chat box. What triggered the Korean War, and when did it start, and how long did it last?
Do you want to go with that one, Troy?
Yeah, I can tackle this one. So and I'm going without notes or anything, so please bear with me on this. The triggering of the Korean War was basically an interplay politically between the Soviet Union, China, and North Korea, and the desire of North Korea to reunify and use power basically provided by Soviet war supplies to achieve that. It started in 1950, and it would go on until July of '53. And you know, it's the first flare-up. It is the first hot spot of the Cold War. And the interesting thing to take from this is this was also the first challenge, not as the U.S. as a world power, but as the United Nations, because it was the United Nations that went in to defend South Korea. And had it not been for China and Soviet Union walking out of the UN Security Council, there's a good chance that the UN would not have been involved. And you will never see that again, where either two of those nations walk out of the Security Council when they're voting on something like this, even if the vote is not going their way, because they have the veto power to stop any security measure the UN is putting together.
Thank you. So it is actually 1 o'clock. I will entertain one more question if there is one, but I'd like to try to keep this on schedule for your, to be sensitive to your timing. So is there one more question, or should we call it a day?
One more question.
There we go. All right, Larry, you got one? Sure.
Yes. So the UN program, World Food for the World, won a UN a prize. But I thought, what's the relation between what I suggested and the Food for Peace program that South Dakota Senator George McGovern was involved with, and also the senator from Kansas?
Are you asking in relation to Eisenhower's people-to-people ideas?
No, no. About this is a different question. There's a World Food Program to the UN. I think it won a Nobel Prize.
Okay.
But there was the UN program, Food for Peace program, which I thought that George McGovern and his friend, the Kansas senator, Bob Dole, founded. I wonder what was the relation. I saw when they got the Peace Prize, it said Eisenhower had suggested the program, but how did it?
That I would have to do research on. I'm not sure how it's connected with the senators from South Dakota and Kansas.
All right, well, thank you. Samantha, if you can share our closing slides. Jeff and Troy, thank you so much for sharing this with us. I know, like I said, we've been talking about it for several months now as we develop the exhibit. So to be able to share it with our public was great. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
So of course, I need to thank the Eisenhower Foundation. It is through the support of the Eisenhower Foundation that we are able to do lifelong learning programs such as this. And our funding this year comes from the Jeffcoat Foundation. So thank you very much for support. Our next program is Tuesday, March 9th at 7 p.m. It is our book club meeting. We will be reading Snow Falling on Cedars, which I've begun. I don't know if anybody else out there has, but I'm looking forward to our discussion on the 9th. And then our next Lunch and Learn is Thursday, March 25th at noon. I'm really looking forward to this program as well. Dr. Sandra Reddish will be talking to us about Japanese Nebraskans. It's going to be a great program, and I hope you can join us for that. And then our next evening program is Tuesday, April 13th at 7 p.m. Dr. Shelley Klein with the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education will be with us talking about the Nazi Party and propaganda. The links to all of these programs can be found on our Facebook page and our website page. So thank you very much for being here today. I appreciate your time, and I hope you have a great afternoon.